Welcome as WVIA Public Media presents Decision 2018, the Pennsylvania 8th Congressional District Debate. Live from the Sordoni Theater at the WVIA Public Media Studios. Our moderator, WVIA-FM's Larry Voitko.
Good evening. I'm Larry Voitko. Welcome to the first in WVIA series of debates among the candidates for seats in the U.S. Congress. Tonight we hear from the two candidates in the 8th District of the House of Representatives. We have a live audience in the Sordoni Theater at the WVIA Public Media Studios, and they've been instructed to applaud only at the conclusion of this debate. Now, due to a ruling earlier this year by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, the district lines were redrawn. The 8th District is the successor to the former 17th District. It now encompasses the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area, along with Pike and Wayne counties and most of Monroe County. The district is currently represented by Congressman Matt Cartwright, who faces Republican challenger Mr. John Schrin. Congressman Matt Cartwright is seeking his fourth term in the U.S. House to represent northeastern Pennsylvania, where he has spent his entire adult life. He is currently a member of the House Appropriations Committee. Prior to his election to Congress, Mr. Cartwright worked as an attorney with Mundley and Cartwright for 25 years and served as a member of the Board of Governors of the American Association for Justice. He earned his undergraduate degree at Hamilton College, where he studied history, and is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Law School. Mr. Cartwright and his wife, Marion Mundley Cartwright, are parents of two sons. They reside in Moosic. The challenger, Mr. John Schrin, is an investment professional. For 20 years, as an investment banker, rising to the position of managing director at J.P. Morgan Chase, and now a partner in Circle Wealth Management, a financial advisory firm founded by his wife of 30 years, Maria. Mr. Schrin is a native of the Lehigh Valley and a graduate of Lehigh and Columbia universities. He later returned to teach at Lehigh and the university's College of Business and Economics. Mr. and Mrs. Schrin have 3 children. WVIA welcomes these candidates as they field questions from our panelists. Andy Mahalchik. He is well known for his many years at WBRE-TV. In his nearly 40-year career as a print, radio, and TV journalist, Andy has earned numerous awards, including an Emmy, and recognition by the Pennsylvania Association of Broadcasters for excellence in reporting. Andy has led the Eyewitness News I-Team for 25 years. He is also a proud supporter of many community organizations in northeastern Pennsylvania. Boris Kravchuk is the politics reporter for the Scranton Times-Tribune. He is the current author of the newspaper's Roderick Random column, which has run every Saturday since November 1895 and brings readers news and analysis about local, state, and federal politics. And Dr. Tom Baldino, professor of political science at Wilkes University. His areas of interest are in American government, Congress, and the presidency, political parties, and elections. He is the co-author of 3 books with his colleague, Dr. Kyle L. Kreider, on voting and elections, and is currently at work on a book on Pennsylvania government and politics. The format for this hour-long debate has been agreed to by both campaigns. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement and 2 minutes for a closing statement. Responses to the questions by our panelists will be held to 90 seconds. However, at the discretion of the moderator, an additional 30 seconds may be allotted to each candidate for rebuttal. All times will be strictly enforced. All the questions are devised by the individual panelists, each of whom submitted a series of questions to WVIA for review prior to tonight's debate. I, as moderator, also have the option to ask a question. We move now to the opening statements, and as determined by a coin toss earlier this evening, Congressman Matt Cartwright will begin. Mr. Cartwright, 2 minutes.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks to everyone at WVIA for sponsoring this debate and our panelists. I think it's so important that we move beyond sound bites and we get into the real issues. For my own part, it has been an honor for me to represent this community in Washington for almost 6 years now. And I think of the two things that I'm proudest of doing there in this time, first, having a hand in bringing $600 million of your tax dollars back to northeastern Pennsylvania, money that comes into the community to help create jobs and better jobs. Very proud of that, want to continue that work. And secondly, the fact that I have been repeatedly recognized as the top Democrat in the U.S. House for reaching across the aisle and getting things done. I do that on purpose because I promised to. When I went to Congress 6 years ago, I promised to not be part of the bickering and the constant fighting that goes on there, but to get together and get things done. Going forward, I want to continue to fight for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and keeping people with pre-existing conditions covered with health insurance and bringing down the skyrocketing cost of prescription meds. We can do that by allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices. I want to keep fighting for veterans, and I want to do something that we haven't done so far in this Congress, and that is we have to invest in our nation. We have to build up our American infrastructure. We'll put a bill on President Trump's desk that invests at least $1 trillion in our roads and our bridges, our water systems, and our sewer systems and broadband internet for rural places like Pennsylvania. We can do this. Send me back to the Congress, and these are the things that I want to continue to work on. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. And Mr. Schrin, your opening statement.
Good evening, and thanks to our hosts, moderators, my wife Maria, and all of you joining us this evening. I'm John Schrin, and I live in Monroe County. I'm a self-made political outsider, 10th generation Pennsylvanian, the grandson of a Shamokin coal miner and a Bethlehem steelworker. I was born, educated, and lived the first 25 years of my life in northeastern Pennsylvania. I learned to hunt and fish on White Deer Lake with my grandfather. Wayne and Pike counties are beautiful communities with wonderful people. They're not swaths of real estate, as my opponent has referred to them. I grew up in a working-class family attending Pennsylvania public schools. I understand that hard work is the cornerstone of success, that if you want something, you work for it. My opponent grew up in Canada, attending elite private schools with a silver spoon in his mouth. It's disingenuous that he's tried to make residency an issue rather than focus on real issues in his record. A record of supporting the radical left, voting 96% of the time with Nancy Pelosi while supporting sanctuary cities and open borders. My opponent is not a moderate, as he'd like you to believe. I look forward to telling you how my experience, knowledge, and values will benefit you to increase prosperity and protect Social Security. Unlike my opponent, I'm not an attorney, or am I a career politician. I actually favor term limits. I'm against partial birth abortion, and I'll defend the Second Amendment. I'm an engineer, a banker, and when elected, I will be the first certified financial planner ever in the history of the United States Congress. I'll take common sense, business sense, and a good heart to Washington to represent all 5 counties of the new 8th Congressional District. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. Well, we move on to the question portion of our debate. And the first question will go to Mr. Schrin. It will be posed by Andy Mahalchik.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Mr. Schrin, what will you do to help rebuild the trust in lawmakers/politicians? Recent polls show that Americans have a very low opinion of lawmakers/politicians, and that opinion is getting lower. And they describe the atmosphere in Washington as downright hostile. And what will you do to change that?
Andy, terrific question. And again, as a political outsider, I think about the lack of cooperation and bipartisanship. One of the things I'd suggest is that going through this process, the ability of people from either political side to just have untruths that are out there around a process. I've worked in the private sector my entire career, other than the time that I taught at Lehigh. And it's one of the things that you need to be able to pull people together, figure out a way to get things done. That's what I did in my business career, and I was very good at it. in terms of taking people with large egos, very important perspectives, oftentimes differing views, but you do it by understanding, by having substance, by bringing alternative views. And you know, I've never been opposed if someone had a great idea to say, that a boy or that a girl, a terrific idea, let's embrace it. Those are the things that we need to go through. And remember, we're all Americans. We may be Republicans, we may be Democrats, we may be independents, but at the end of the day, we're Americans, and we're elected to get things done for the people that have sent us to Washington. So I very much would look forward to getting things done, reaching across the aisle.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. Mr. Cartwright?
Sure. It's what I've been doing for almost 6 years now. I'm making friends, developing relationships with people across the aisle. It's not just a slogan. It's not just something that I'm throwing out of my back pocket. This is something that I've been doing, and you can measure that. There's a website you can go on called govtrack.us, and it actually measures the ability of people to attract co-sponsors for their legislation, the ability of them to reach across the aisle. We get report cards every Congress from govtrack.us, and that's the thing I was talking about when I said I've been ranked the #1 Democrat in introducing bills that gain Republican co-sponsors. A co-sponsorship means that you like the bill, you're likely to vote for it if it comes up for a vote on the floor of the House. And I've been successful not only in getting co-sponsorships from Republicans, but in passing bills. I worked so hard at it. I remember an older timer in the Congress said to me, Matt, I see you working the floor, working the other side for bills, and you know, don't bother. If you get a good idea, somebody's going to steal it. You're never going to pass anything. Well, I'm here to tell you, I haven't served 6 years, and I have passed 3 major bills. I've got on my wall in Washington, you can come on down and see it, I've got Barack Obama's signature on a bill, and I have Donald J. Trump's signature on one of my bills on the wall in my office in Washington, D.C. I know what it is to work together with the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. The second question comes from Boris Kravchuk, and the first to answer is Congressman Cartwright.
Gentlemen, we all saw what happened in Pittsburgh over the weekend, and I can't think of a country in the world off the top of my head where mass shootings happen more often than in the United States. It's become far too commonplace. So I'm wondering what you as congressman would do about that. Is it the answer more gun control, and what do you think about more gun control? Or the answer something else?
Boris, I have to say I was shocked and stricken and heartbroken by what happened in Pittsburgh, and in fact we suspended our campaigning for the day because of that, in respect of the loss of life and of the attack on a synagogue. We can't have that in this country. It's unspeakable. As far as gun violence in this country, there is no one single solution to all of it. There are a lot of partial solutions, but things that Americans agree on, by and large, are things like no fly, no buy. If a person is on a terrorist watch list such that he or she is not allowed to get on a commercial airliner, that person is probably somebody, it ought to be harder for them to purchase a firearm. I'm for that. Things like expanded background checks and closing gun show loopholes, things like that. Things where we take a harder look at the mental stability of the people who might be buying firearms. Again, it's not a panacea, but it's something that we ought to be looking into. And you know, I've been serving in the minority my entire time in the Congress. It's been run by Republicans, and they have refused to bring up even the most moderate of these bills. I say it's time for the Democrats to take over the House so we can bring up common sense gun legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Schrin.
Like Matt, I also believe that the events in Pittsburgh were tragic and unacceptable in the American society. It's something when we look, though, and think about what is the root cause or causes of what's taking place. We, as a country, have dialed back very significantly the amount of money that is spent on mental health, pushing and letting people that shouldn't be available in society gain access to weapons potentially. And that's something, when you look at it, I would say there's really 3 things from a guns and weapons in the society perspective. We need to spend more money on mental health to make sure that those individuals that need to get the appropriate help get it. The second thing is we need to make sure that there is also the appropriate training. As I grew up as a child with my grandfather going to White Deer Lake, I was impressed very significantly with the danger and importance of handling weapons safely. And the third thing is I think we also have to reflect as a society, looking at the type of dehumanization of life that we see in video games and movies. Those are all things that are contributory to some of the actions that take place. But I will tell you, I am someone who will strongly defend the Second Amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. We'll move on to the next question. It will be going to Mr. Schrin first and Dr. Tom Baldino.
So my question deals with health care and health insurance. I will assume that both candidates support the idea of providing access to health insurance for people with pre-existing conditions.
Yes.
If you don't assume that, okay, great. So then the question is, how do you make that insurance, especially for people with pre-existing condition, affordable, such that a middle-class family isn't confronted with potentially $20,000 or more in expenses that include premiums, co-pays, and co-insurance?
Yep. Doctor, and a terrific question. I'm not a medical person, but again, I put on my business hat. I always revert back to engineering to look at problems to try to solve them. As I've gone through to think about healthcare in the United States and the amount of money we spend, our issue is not the amount of money that we spend, it's how it's spent and is it spent efficiently. So for instance, if we look at the United States, we spend approximately 18 to 19% of our GDP on healthcare and have a life expectancy of X. We can look at other countries around the globe that spend 11 to 12% of their GDP on healthcare with a comparable life expectancy. That difference in terms of the cost associated getting the same life expectancy, I view that as our opportunity. That's an opportunity to bend the cost curve, drive down costs, make pre-existing conditions covered, and make sure that health care is more affordable to more people in our society. So you'll say, John, what do you do to make that happen? I'll give you a fantastic example. President Obama ordered the digitization of medical records. Yet, unfortunately, that legislation didn't speak to doctors, healthcare providers, or others, so that today we have 36 disparate systems that capture digitized medical records, and that data is not able to be utilized to be used in artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms to take and drive down costs lower, and to also do better policing of bad actors, pharmacies, doctors, overprescribing. Those are the opportunities that we have to go over and make sure we capture them.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. Thank you. Mr. Cartwright.
Thanks for the question, Dr. Baldino. Yes, we have a healthcare crisis in this country. This is a nation where we spend roughly $10,000 per capita on healthcare, and we end up, in terms of life expectancy, we're about number 28 on the list in the world. It's ridiculous. We're overspending, and we're getting mediocre at best results. That was something that the Journal of the American Medical Association came up with earlier this year and the year before. I noticed that Forbes magazine responded to that a couple of months later in April, and they point out that we have a geography problem in the United States, and that is we have a lot of territory to cover that some of those other nations don't. But we also have a higher poverty rate in the U.S. We have hugely higher prescription med prices, which goes into that $10,000, and that's why we have to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical companies. The answer is to continue to let the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act work in ways to make it work better and cheaper for more people. I also support expanding Medicare as well. This is a program that runs on 3% administrative expenses. It's enormously efficient. But that's what we ought to look at is taking advantage of our wonderful Medicare system we have in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. And Mr. Schrin, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
Sure. And I would say to the listeners out there, this is an area where Mr. Cartwright and I disagree pretty significantly. I do not believe that nationalized health care is the path that this country should go down. It's something that if we look at the cost associated with that, $32 trillion, the amount of money that would need to be raised in terms of incremental taxes, that's not what we should do. The government has not proven itself to be efficient at most things, and for them to take health care, for us to wind up waiting in line, taking a ticket, and winding up having reduced health care, I just don't think is acceptable.
Mr. Schrin. Thank you. Mr. Cartwright, 30 seconds.
A quick rebuttal to that. First of all, I think it's not likely that we're going to get to Medicare for all. Much more likely interim situation is allowing people ages 50 to 64 to buy into Medicare, which could be a nice interim solution. But when somebody gets up and tells you $32 trillion over 10 years, what they're not telling you is the other half, which is that it's going to be much more than that if you add up all the health care premiums. And studies have shown that we would save money.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Well, we move on to the second round of questioning. And Mr. Cartwright will field this question first. It comes from Boris Kravchuk.
You both have different opinions on the tax cuts that Congress passed last December and the President signed. Mr. Cartwright, could you tell us why you voted against them? And Mr. Schrin, could you tell us why you support them?
Boris, not only did I vote against that tax cut, but I spoke out loudly against it. You know, here in northeastern Pennsylvania, we know what it is to lose jobs to other countries, to offshoring of jobs. Places like RCA, when they moved to Mexico, we had as many as 1,600 manufacturing jobs just go away like that. The devastation that it caused in our country. That tax cut bill, it took the corporate tax rate, which I agree the corporate tax rate should have come down, but they took it to 21% for American companies making profits in this country, but down to 15% for American companies making profits in other countries. That's a huge incentive to offshore more jobs. We've had about enough of that in northeastern Pennsylvania. We need to create incentives for more manufacturing jobs here in Pennsylvania, here in northeastern Pennsylvania. I also voted against that tax bill because it gives 83% of the tax cuts to the top 1% and the corporations. People that don't need the money, that are just going to put it in their brokerage accounts, or the corporations are just going to buy back their shares with that money. If you want to help the middle class, don't go on with this poppycock about trickle-down economics. We all know that doesn't work. If you want to help the middle class, give the tax cuts to the middle class. We'll redo that bill, and we'll give those tax cuts to the middle class. Democrats will.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Schrin.
Wow. Having worked in the real sector for 25 years, that's not the way companies and investors make decisions. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is one of the most prolific things to revitalize and cause a renaissance in the U.S. around manufacturing. If you look and see what's going to happen, as corporations are able to make a decision that at 21% the U.S. is now competitive with the rest of the world, they will look to make significant investment in plants and manufacturing facilities here. We're already starting to see it. The fact that there's a lower rate overseas, they were already able to circumvent that by having offshore companies that could go through and pay 0 to no taxes related to it. So the reference to the 15% makes no sense. Also, when we think about the number of percentages associated with the wealthy, the 83% actually tracked exactly what the wealthiest were paying at that point, so it would make common sense. If you were paying 83%, you'd get 83%. Post-Tax Cut Jobs Act, the wealthiest people, that same group, actually had their burden of taxes being paid increase from 83 to 86.9%. So look, this is something that I feel very strongly. One of the things we need to do is to come back and lock in the tax cuts for the middle class, not the wealthy. That is something that I would make a top priority when we go to Washington, because the economy has been growing faster, we can afford to do it, and we should lock it in for the middle class today so they don't sunset.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. We move on to the next question, and it comes from Tom Baldino, and Mr. Schrin is the first to answer.
So continuing on this vein with the tax cut, but the consequences of the tax cut, the annual deficits are increasing, the national debt is increasing. Speaker Paul Ryan and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell are both on record publicly stating that lowering the cost of Social Security and Medicare programs are under consideration as ways of reducing the size of the deficits and the national debt by reducing the size of future benefits and establishing a means test for future beneficiaries. Democratic leaders, on the other hand, in both chambers, have suggested increasing taxes or cutting programs as a way of solving the problem, but have not included anything specific. What is your position on the contribution of both Social Security and Medicare as targets for lowering the federal budget deficit?
Look, I was asked the question, do I believe that we should cut Social Security? And I responded no. My opponent actually had someone who came in and illegally videotaped me for over an hour. And I would say that tape should be released in its entirety in terms of what I said in that meeting. And I'd be very proud for every listener, every voter to look and see what I said. We should not look at Social Security as something to necessarily reduce the deficit. I think we can be smarter. We can have more people working to pay into the system. We can look, if there is fraud in the system, to try to take it out. My grandparents were two people that only had Social Security in their retirement. When she was in a nursing home and they no longer could afford to take care of her, Social Security paid for that nursing home, and when she died, the state of Pennsylvania took that house. So the idea that I don't understand the devastation and the toughness that people go through is just unacceptable. We have people in this country, okay, that are suffering. Veterans, people on Social Security, retirees. We need to take care of those people. As I go out and knock on doors and listen to people, the pain and suffering is extraordinary. We need to make sure that they get properly taken care of in this country. I am not a mean-spirited person, and one of the things I would make sure, again, with the certified financial planning background, to make sure that whatever changes would be put forth, that they make sense
Thank you,
for
Mr.
all of
Schrin.
us.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cartwright.
Dr. Baldino, you are absolutely correct. Both Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell have pointed to Medicare and Social Security as responsible for creating the budget deficit. They call them entitlements. That's what they call them. I find that offensive. Entitlements, as if people getting this money as a gift from the government are walking around feeling entitled to it. It's ridiculous. It's offensive. It's your money. It's like somebody going around saying your savings account is an entitlement of yours. That's ridiculous. Yes, these people, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, who will still be there, they will attempt to cut these programs, to cut the deficit that was created by that tax law last year. 83% of the money going to the top 1% in the corporations. And now they're pointing to what they call the entitlement programs to make up the difference. It's absolutely clear as a bell. And if you send somebody like another Republican to Congress, that's going to create a majority, and that would make it happen. Now, John Schrin got caught dead to rights talking to the young Republicans of Luzerne County about how his idea for shoring up Social Security is to use the chain CPI, cut the cost of living increases by 0.2%. I've been speaking out against that. I've been protesting against chain CPI since 2013. We don't want to do that to our seniors.
Thank you, Congressman.
If I may, Matt, that's not what I said. When I was illegally recorded, what I talked about was the change in the CPI in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It had nothing to do with Social Security. And by the way, also in that videotape, there was a discussion about health care in terms of what could take place to drive down the costs. And I said, well, maybe at some point there would be somebody who would consider looking at tort reform. You know what my opponent did? He took that video clip and he sent it out to all the trial attorneys that fund his campaign to say, be careful, Mr. Schrin may come in and try to change what we're going to do on tort law.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. Mr. Cartwright, 30 seconds.
And how often do you hear that? When somebody gets caught dead to rights saying something on videotape, they're going to cry and say it was an illegal tape. Well, I think we just heard Mr. Schrin say he's not a lawyer. He's not a lawyer. And I'm here to tell you that it was a public meeting. There was no expectation of privacy. And what the heck are you saying? There should be an expectation of privacy? Was that something where you were whispering about your plans to cut the cost of living increases for seniors? None of it makes sense. You were caught dead to rights.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. We need to move on. We need to move on. Andy Mahalchik will give the next question, and it'll first be answered by Mr. Schrin.
Okay, Mr. Schrin, I want to talk to you ask you about the Migrant Caravan heading toward the southern U.S. border. Most recent estimates, about 8,000 people. The issue has come down to a very hard line on both the Democrats and Republican side, almost like a wall between the two sides. Is there a common ground that can be found whereas we can protect our southern border and our sovereignty, but at the same time provide compassion and relief to families who really need it?
Apologies. I made a mistake. This goes to Mr. Cartwright first.
Matt.
Good thing I was listening to the question. Andy, yeah, obviously this is a tragedy unfolding on television before our very eyes. Here's what I believe on immigration first. I believe we should have comprehensive immigration reform. We have to secure our borders. We have to do things to make sure our laws are followed. I am a rule of law candidate. I am a lawyer, and I believe in enforcement of the laws, and where laws are broken, there must be accountability. And I think that I believe in a tough but fair path to citizenship for the people in this country, and it has to be seriously tough. I mean, so tough penalties that people think twice before they come to our nation. As resorting to that. I'm not for amnesty. We tried that back in the 1980s, and all that does is it encourages more people to come to our shores. My view of these people in the caravan, we have to follow the law, Andy. We have to look at are there claims for asylum? If there are, we have to follow what due process laws are in place. We have to give them a fair hearing to see if there are legitimate claims for asylum, and if they are not, we follow the law, and we reject these people.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Schrin.
Sure. Well, this is an area, interestingly, I have a lot of direct experience with. My wife, Maria, is a native of Honduras. I've traveled to Honduras 50 times in my life. I know what the life is of the Honduran people in that country, but there are laws. If you want to come to the United States, Maria's family members for years had to go to the American embassy to get a visa. What we're seeing is an unprecedented attack on the United States sovereignty in terms of people traversing through Guatemala, Mexico, coming to the United States. This is the issue. When we have people like Mr. Cartwright go through and just describe that he'd support a wall, it's very fascinating that his potential future speaker, Ms. Pelosi, if they do gain the House control, has already said that come December there will not be a single Democrat that votes for a wall. And you know what? The United States has had a broken immigration system for 40 years. Both parties are responsible for the breakdown of the system. And we start by fixing it by, number one, securing our borders. It's not only the southern frontier, but we have to look at our ports, the airports, and when people come to this country and overstay their visas, they should not be allowed back in for extended periods of time. But we have to start first and foremost with securing the border, and I can tell you unequivocally that if you look at it, I will support the president and his administration of building a barrier on the southern border, because you know what? It actually makes economic sense in terms of the reduced social cost, contraband, weapons that come into this country.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. We move on to the third round of questions, and the question will come from Tom Baldino, and Mr. Schrin will answer this question first.
Okay, so the UN issued a report recently that declared that the Earth's temperature is increasing dramatically, and that unless something is done to stop and reverse global warming, the consequences for life on our planet will be devastating and irreversible. What is your position on global warming, and what should the federal government do about it, if anything?
Right. I'm an engineer, scientist, so you'd have to look at the facts. And at this point, you would say that the human species has been the one species that appears to have caused some type of change in the trajectory of what's going on with the planet's temperatures. And that's something that we need to be very cognizant of and figure out what we do to try to help make sure that that stops or declines. I will also say, however, that when I look, it shouldn't place an undue burden on the United States companies and workers, so that when we think about what's taking place, where the most violating emissions are coming from, they're not from the United States at this point. We need to look to India and China and the vast amounts of sulfur-spewing coal that they still burn. So we need to try to do this in a balanced way where we don't unnecessarily burden U.S. corporations and have jobs leave, have people lose employment opportunities. But it is something that I think we can find a common ground to try to work with our neighbors around the world to come up with something that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schrin. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you for the question. Climate change is an existential issue. It's a threat. Scientists know it. The great majority of thinking people understand that this is true. And in fact, when I first got to the Congress, it was anathema. It was forbidden for Republican members of the House to utter that phrase, climate change or global warming or anything like that. But I've seen the needle move. I have seen the needle move so that Republicans now can say out loud there is such a thing as climate change and that something ought to be done about it. How do you know? Because something that I helped start was the Climate Solutions Caucus. Now has 41 members of Congress who are Republicans in that Climate Solutions Caucus. I've been a leader in the fight against climate change, and you know what? American corporations understand the importance of this. So many of the Fortune 500 American corporations have taken the green climate pledges or the We're Still in Paris pledges. And my own view is a very hopeful one. Even though that was a dark report, Doctor, that you saw, I have a hopeful view of this because the needle is moving in the Congress, and ultimately where American corporations go, Republican politicians will follow. And that's why I think that we're going to get to this and put something on President Trump's desk that leads to getting back into Paris.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. We move on to the next question. It comes from Addie Mahalchik, and Congressman Cartwright will be the first to answer.
Okay. This is hard coal country. Pennsylvania is coal country to begin with. We've heard that President Trump digs coal. What is your stance on the future of coal? Has its time passed? Is it DOA?
This is coal country. And I've been so proud to live here. I got married here in 1985. I've been living here and working here. And my wife Marion's in the audience. And we got married in St. Thomas Aquinas Church, which is not far from an entrance to an old coal mine, Andy. I understand a lot about coal country. But you know, what's been happening to coal is free market forces. The low price of natural gas and the abundance of natural gas has been driving the cost of energy so low that it doesn't make financial sense to keep mining coal. Of course, I think that's a good thing because coal is the huge contributor to carbon emissions and global warming and climate change and all of the things that follow. Your question is, what is the future of coal? It all depends on the market forces. Right now, the future is with the Marcellus Shale and turning that into abundant local electricity that we can use to power local manufacturing processes. This is what's happening, and the coal is nothing. There's no war on coal going on. It's just the natural market forces that are leading to natural gas winning out over coal.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Schrin.
The markets are efficient. So when you go through and look at the opportunities for coal today, they're not the same way they were for my grandfather or my great-grandfather, both who were miners up in Shamokin and Excelsior. So the world changes, but there can always be new opportunities. Anthracite coal is still used in the making of steel. There are other potential opportunities around mines in terms of rare earth elements that can get extracted. That's something we don't talk about a lot in this country in terms of some of the national security risk we have around the elements that are necessary in many of the modern technological devices we have. Maybe we can do something, maybe we can't, but you have to look at the science related to it. There are things around carbon fibers that we can look to see, are there ways to also utilize some of the coal mines. But you know what? This is an area, the most efficient coal is not mined in Pennsylvania any longer, or even in West Virginia. It comes from Wyoming, from the Powder River Basin, and that's the coal that gets sent over to China and India. It's very efficient to take it out, it's low cost, but we need to move on. We need to think about a whole bunch of other opportunities in terms of energy and what we're going to do. And I've talked already about the opportunity of trying to transform Lackawanna County and have Scranton become the hub of research around battery storage from the electricity that gets generated from the natural gas. It's some of the power plants that we have here. Those are the type of bold ideas that we need to have, rather than looking in the rearview mirror to the past.
We move on to the next question. It comes from Boris Kravchuk, And Mr. Schrin will be the first to answer this question.
Mr. Schrin, Mr. Cartwright's TV commercials routinely claim that you live in New Jersey. You say that's not true. Obviously, you grew up in Lehigh Valley and you've lived in New Jersey a long time. Could you explain why you think 8th District voters should believe that your heart's really here and you understand what's important to them? And then for Mr. Cartwright, why is his residency so important when you didn't even grow up in Pennsylvania? And others like Hillary Clinton never lived in New York before they ran for the Senate. And why should voters believe you understand them better than Mr. Schrin? So Mr. Schrin, I guess, goes first.
Boris, anyone who listened to the opening statement that I had clearly understands I live in Monroe County. I've been back in Pennsylvania for well over a year. And what people need to recognize is that I never really left. When you have parents, brothers, cousins that have continuously lived here, I taught at Lehigh University from 2009 to 2012. This has been a transition over a multi-year period to get involved in terms of community service. I have a history in this Commonwealth that dates back to 1740 in terms of my forefathers. Very proud to have great-grandparents that were born and raised in Luzerne County. In fact, I was out knocking doors not too long ago in Inkerman, a little borough in Luzerne County where my great-grandmother came from. My grandmother's great-grandparents were from this area as well. And understanding the migration patterns of where people would go to work, we move all over to find work if you're a working-class person. So this narrative that I am a person from New Jersey, no. I have more Pennsylvanian in me than most people will ever have in their lifetime because of the heritage and the roots and the working-class upbringing that I had for people very proud to call themselves a Pennsylvanian. And I've always identified myself as a Pennsylvanian.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schrin. Mr. Cartwright.
Thanks for the question, Boris. I was born in Erie. When you're a kid, you move where your parents go. When I was 10, we moved to Canada. We lived there for a number of years. I graduated high school there, came right back to the United States. When I met Marion, we got married in Archibald, and we decided to settle here. And that's the big difference is when you have the power to decide where you're going to live, where do you live? We decided to raise our family right here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Why? Because we love the values here. We love the values of integrity and truth and honesty and trust. And these are things that we've taught our two boys. We chose to live here in northeastern Pennsylvania. And, you know, we stood up in court for regular working families fighting against insurance companies and huge corporations. And we got to know their concerns and understand their sufferings and their sorrows. And Marion and I are very proud to say that we have chosen to be here in northeastern Pennsylvania. And that's why residency matters, Boris, because it's where you choose to spend your adult life that determines who are the people you care about. All of these places, all of these wonderful counties that are in the new 8th District of Pennsylvania, Wayne and Pike, Lackawanna, Monroe, Luzerne, we've represented families in all parts of these areas. We've been proud to do it, and that's why residency makes a difference in this matter.
Rebuttal, Mr. Schrin.
Yes. I am a resident, Matt, of Pennsylvania. Whether you like to believe it or not, I am. I'm going to vote for myself and not you. And let me tell you, there are a lot of people in this district that unfortunately don't have the ability to find work in their chosen profession to live here. That's one of the things that I want to change, that we can have more people, young people, that don't need to leave the area the way I did to go someplace else. And if we have less lawyers and more people with a solid business background in terms of what you do to attract business here, that won't happen.
Thank
and
you.
it's
Thank you,
something
Mr.
that's
Schrin.
necessary.
Mr. Cartwright, 30
The fact
seconds.
of the matter is, John, you were a functionary for Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan. You know less about making jobs than anybody in this room. All you ever did was destroy jobs. Those deals that you put together, they cost workers 18,000 jobs. The Washington Mutual merger, and also the Bear Stearns merger. We're talking about file room clerks and secretaries and IT professionals. 18,000 people lost their jobs. That's what you know how to do.
I'll allow you 30 more seconds if you'd like.
Wow, Matt, I mean, you really should stop because you don't know what you're talking about. I've created jobs around the country, oftentimes with women entrepreneurs. The largest bank in Maryland today was started because of a capital investment that I made with a woman who said, should I go out and start a bank? She did. It's now the largest bank down there. There's a large company in terms of financial technology that was started 8 years ago that was bought by Northwestern Mutual. Again, hundreds of jobs just with that one company. So no, Matt, I didn't destroy jobs. I helped create economic value.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. Would you like to rebut? No, let's move on. I will exercise my right to ask a question. The U.S. Constitution lists as a function of government ensuring domestic tranquility. Reports indicate that citizenry has a high level of stress and anxiety regarding the current state of the country. What do you think is the cause of this anxiety? And is the leadership of the United States doing its part to ensure domestic tranquility? And if not, what can be done? Mr. Cartwright.
Sure. Leadership starts at the top, I do my part to try to foster cooperation with Republicans and not stir up trouble. One thing I do wish the president would cut down on Twitter. I think most people feel that, and I think you know, it's part of everybody's really. It's incumbent on all leaders of the United States to speak in ways that bring us together instead of drive us apart, to look for things that bind us together, to look for the commonality, the things that we share rather than the things that divide us. We're all Americans. That's why I talk about in terms of the importance of building American infrastructure. We're in a serious situation right now, Larry, where we have to compete with Russia and China and the EU, and we have a chance to make our nation competitive with other nations in the world and other continents. We ought to be taking that up. We ought to be believing in our own nation and investing in ourselves to build up American infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our water systems, our sewer systems, our internet systems. We have to protect our electrical grid. We have to invest in cybersecurity. We're at cyber warfare right now. These are the things that we have to get together and do.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Schrin.
You know, when we think about it, it's really sad that we actually have individuals that go and take the type of actions that they did, whether it's the bombs that were sent to leadership within the Democratic Party, whether the killings that took place in Pittsburgh. We need to have civility in this country. We need to have tranquility. And some of this comes from hope. We need to provide hope and opportunity for people, that there is a brighter future, that there is employment opportunities that will provide for them good family-sustaining wages. That's not going to come necessarily from the government. The private sector, in my belief, is best suited at creating those opportunities. You can have a combination of partnership, but the government needs to be the minority partner around these things. What I worry about, in terms of what the Congressman just described, is that we don't want to have a white elephant in terms of money that the federal government spends on infrastructure projects that don't have good paybacks. As a business person, I would want to make sure infrastructure projects have a framework around them by which we would measure what are the benefits in terms of the economic growth or quality of life advantages that we would get. So for instance, if there's rail put in from northeastern Pennsylvania to New York, that would be a quality of life issue. That's a good thing. If we think about other projects that could take place, the energy investment around the battery, and there's so many things we can do, but you have to have a structured way of thinking about it to make sure we invest in the right projects.
Thank you, Mr. Schrin. All right, we have time for one more question, Andy Mahalchik.
Okay, lucky me.
And this will be Mr. Schrin.
Mr. Schrin,
first. All right, Andy.
in the, we were just talking about civility, bringing about changing the political climate in Washington. Maybe we could start that here now. Is there one positive attribute you see from Mr. Cartwright that you see as an American that you see as a positive attribute from Mr. Cartwright?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know Matt. I mean, I've met him, you know, in instances like this. People that have known him speak very, very highly of him in terms of his family values that he described, you know, his wife and children and how they've brought them up. Those are good things to be involved in the community. Obviously, a very smart person as well. So those are all things that I would say, that's good. That's what America should be about.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cartwright.
I was going to say the same thing. Obviously, a family person, somebody who has kept together with his wife for many decades, and I salute and congratulate that. it's how I'm built as well. Marion and I just celebrated 33 years together, and that's why it matters to me, and that, I applaud that in Mr. Schrin.
Well, thank you. Well, it's time to move on to the closing statements. The debate is coming to a close, and the first to give the closing statement is Mr. Cartwright.
Thanks, Larry. Well, so here we have a choice. We have me. I've been serving in the Congress for almost 6 years. I made it onto the Appropriations Committee. It's a place from which wonderful things have been done for northeastern Pennsylvania. It's a playbook I want to follow, and I'm proud to represent this area. At the same time, we have my opponent who basically skydived into northeastern Pennsylvania and started telling us about his northeastern Pennsylvania values right away, and he was still gathering up his parachute in July when he started running these really awful ads about me, attacking me, telling people that I was responsible for heinous crimes in Philadelphia. It was awful. Insults, distractions, distortions, straight up lies. Well, there's one thing I can tell you about the values of northeastern Pennsylvania, and they do not include those things. Insults, distractions, distortions, straight up lies. We don't raise our children like that in northeastern Pennsylvania. That's one reason Marion and I decided to raise our kids in northeastern Pennsylvania, and we have lived here for over 30 years. Here in northeastern Pennsylvania, we build each other up. We don't tear each other down. We value taking care of our seniors, not shoring up Social Security by taking money out of seniors' cost of living adjustments. And that's an old formula, that idea, change CPI. I've been protesting against that since I started in Congress in 2013. Our values include taking care of the sick, protecting people with pre-existing conditions, having a real plan to reduce the cost of prescription meds, like allowing Medicare to negotiate with it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been the honor of my life to represent this community and show off our values in Washington, and I do hope you give me the chance to stay there and keep doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. And Mr. Schrin, you have the last word.
Thank you. This is an election where the voters are going to have a very sharp contrast between two individuals. If you're somebody who likes higher taxes, more job-killing regulations, unaffordable health care, and sanctuary cities and open borders, you're going to want to vote for my opponent. If you agree, like I do, that lower taxes, less regulations, affordable health care, and protecting Social Security and strong borders are important, then I'm your guy. I also think that this is an election that, as you go and think about your values, northeastern Pennsylvanian values, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or independent, are you somebody that really associates with the values and policies of Nancy Pelosi and Maxine Waters? Having grown up here and living here, I would respectfully submit that those are not our values. Yet my opponent has consistently voted for those values and policies. He'd like you to believe that he's a moderate bipartisan individual. He isn't. I've had the opportunity to ask people in the Republican Party, have you known Matt Cartwright? Do you know who he is? And they look and they say, we don't know who he is. So all the bills that have supposedly been passed that he's worked on, they don't seem to have made it to the top of the chain in terms of what's taking place. Look, as an engineer, banker, and certified financial planner, I have the skill set, experience, and vision to increase the economic prosperity and well-being of northeastern Pennsylvania. I'd like to go to Washington again, as I said before, take common sense, business sense, and a good heart to represent you in Washington. Look, what the congressman described as far as appropriations and dollars that come back to the district, it's not the way it works anymore. It worked like that when Joe McDade was there and you were able to get money to come back. We now need to look at the private sector to bring in jobs. I'm the person who understands how the private sector works best, and I will be the person to bring those opportunities here. I humbly request and ask for your vote on November 6th.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schrin. Thank you so much. Well, with those statements, we come to the end of this debate between the candidates for the 8th Congressional District seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Thanks again to Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Schrin for participating, and thanks to our panel, Andy Mahalchik, Boris Kravchuk, and Tom Baldino. Now, tomorrow evening at 7, our series continues with a debate between the candidates for the 9th Congressional District. Republican Dan Muser will square off against Democrat Denny Wolf. It's Pennsylvania Decision 2018 on WVIA Public Media. Next Tuesday, November 6th, is Election Day, so make sure you get out and vote. I'm Larry Wojtko. Thanks so much for watching, and good night. WVIA Public Media presents Pennsylvania Decision 2018, the Pennsylvania 9th Congressional District